Looking at a bike, there are a lot of things that can be changed to make it fit better to your body. If the reach feels too long, you can swap out the stem and get shorter reach. You can slide your saddle forward and aft or even swap it out for different setback seat posts. You can even get bikes in different wheel sizes. Proportional wheel sizing is now a thing. We've come a long way, but there is one part of the bike that remains shockingly stagnant with very little variability, and that is crank length. I don't know about you, but to me this seems like a little bit of an important oopsie, considering that cycling is predominantly a leg sport. Most large bike brands and component manufacturers only stock a few lengths, 170, 172.5, and 175 being the most common. On occasion, someone will just go crazy and will offer a crank in a 165, but that's about it. Between 165 and 175, that's only a centimeter of difference. It's supposed to accommodate like an almost infinite variation of leg lengths. I've always suspected that I could benefit from different length cranks, but it's one of those things that's really difficult or expensive to mess around with. Unlike adjusting a stem, that's pretty simple. A crank, since it's tied to the drivetrain, is a little bit more complicated. I've reached out to Matt at Appleman Bicycles, who's been a huge proponent of proportional cranks, and he sent over his fit cranks to experiment on the channel. So thank you, Matt. And I have to say, it has been an interesting eye-opener and one of the more significant upgrades or changes I've made ever to all my bikes. So while these are fit cranks, they are designed to be ridden outside and not just on a trainer. You can buy these cranks, they're a little bit on the spendy side, or you can rent them for, I believe, $100 for about 2 weeks. That does require like a $600 deposit. You get that back minus the 100. When you factor that in, it becomes a little bit more reasonable. You can select the spindle length depending on your frame, as well as a variety of spiders for different drivetrain. The way these cranks are designed is there's a big honking crank arm, and it's drilled for various crank lengths from 100 to 175. What's cool about this is that means it's super easy to change the virtual crank length, or actually the actual crank length, in the middle of the ride to see how it feels. Full disclaimer, before we get into this, I'm not a bike fitter, but I am super curious about things like bike fit, and just because it's right for me doesn't mean it's right for you. I don't mean this to be a prescriptive video, but just meant to share my personal experience playing with crank lengths and where I landed. To make sure I wasn't completely going in this blind, I did do a live stream with Matt a few weeks ago talking about how he came to this and his observations. On his website, there are various resources, some of the science behind proportional crank length, as well as calculators to figure out what is your supposed ideal crank length. Playing with the calculators, I have to admit, I was surprised to see that it suggested 155, which just seems crazy short. 165 I was expecting, but 155? I mean, that sounds like a kid's crank, doesn't it? I put my skepticism aside and decided to try it out on our gravel loop here in Missoula. My plan was to alternate between 175, which I knew was clearly too long, and 155, which was recommended but seemed too short. I would do this on both the flat and the climbing sections to see how it would feel and if I would notice the difference. Again, I'm not a bike fitter, but I've had several bike fits over the course of my life, as well as playing with tools like my VeloFit, which lets you, fit yourself. And during all the fits I've had, there have been some kind of common issues that I've experienced. One thing that usually comes up is that my hips rock a lot.
Talking to fitters, the number one thing I hear is stability, stability, stability. If you're riding buddies, oh yeah, you're all over the bike. Well, that might be an indication that your cranks are too long and they're actually shoving you around.
Another thing that's been brought up by some bike fitters is one of my knees tend to wander at the top of the stroke.
Another common one is you'll see at the top of a pedal stroke, someone's knee will go out and then come back down. The bones in their femur and hip might be colliding a little bit, and you can get away from that by kicking out to the side right at the top of the pedal stroke and then coming back in.
Armed with some pretty basic knowledge, I hit the road to test it out. Okay, so I'm riding with the cranks at 175, and it's pretty interesting. One of the things that surprised me is that the difference was noticeable. Like on the scale of, is it kind of noticeable like a derailleur koozie, or is it really noticeable? It was definitely on the really noticeable end of the spectrum. I think it would make that much of a difference, but it feels like I'm making really big circles with my feet, and they're moving a lot slower. I started out with the longer crank length and it felt good, like I was applying like a lot of power. My cadence felt pretty slow, and after just a couple minutes I could feel my left knee start to twinge a little. I don't know if the side view will show this in comparison, but it does feel like my knees are moving a little bit up higher. It's still somewhat rideable. It's fascinating how noticeable it is, just that, I don't know, 1 centimeter difference. When I switched over to 155, it was shocking how noticeable it was. Immediately, I had the sensation of my feet making much smaller circles. My cadence was a lot quicker. And one thing I didn't realize, but doing the crank length change made really apparent, was how high my knees were coming up before. I felt like I was kind of kneeing my abdomen, but now I felt like I was making more fluid circles with my feet. And I have to say, it felt really good. Like the bike felt like it fit better all of a sudden, way more comfortable. Even getting in the drops was a more comfortable position since my knees weren't going up so high. I alternated a couple times on the flat section and definitely preferred the shorter crank length. Riding in the flats was interesting, but I was really curious how it would affect how it felt on the bike while climbing. With a longer crank arm, you get more leverage, a little bit easier to turn over those lower gears. And I think this is when things got interesting and the differences became more noticeable to me. Going uphill, the 175s did feel good in some ways. It was a lot easier to turn over the lower gears just because you have more leverage. But what I noticed was when I was standing and climbing, I had a tough time getting my leg over the top of the pedal stroke. I felt like I was a track runner doing hurdles, you know, like throwing your leg up and over the hurdles. And this is pretty crazy because I usually ride 170s and I didn't think 5 mil would make such a huge difference. But I definitely felt that standing and climbing was kind of impaired, didn't feel very natural, really had to throw my hips over. In contrast, when I shifted to the 155, it was like the complete opposite. When I was standing and climbing, it felt a lot easier to get my foot over the top of the pedal stroke. I didn't feel like I was throwing my hips. It felt as if I could make smoother circles while standing and climbing. One interesting downside, however, is that it made the lower gears feel just like that tiny bit tougher. Feels like I lost like a shift or two. But again, the overall experience was a lot better. Like sitting and climbing, again, I didn't feel like my knees were going up into my chest and I wasn't throwing my legs over hurdles. It was just a lot spinnier, which I prefer. After this single ride, I was pretty much sold on going with a shorter crank. To me, everything felt a lot more comfortable. I ended up buying some Ledixna cranks from a fellow Discord member. What's cool about these cranks is they have my favorite BCD 110x74, and they're also offered in a lot of crank lengths for not a whole lot of money. And they use an external bottom bracket if that's important to you. And they have a low Q factor. They're actually a really cool crank. I've been riding with those cranks the last couple weeks and I'm just absolutely sold. Even though they are 162.5s and not quite the 155s that the calculators suggested, I could feel the same things. You know, my knees weren't going into my chest. I didn't feel like I was running hurdles when I was standing and climbing. I found that I have acclimated to that shifting feeling in gearing, so now it feels normal. And I think in the future, I might actually get shorter cranks still, maybe just 160s. So that's been my experience using Matt's Fit Cranks, which are a great tool. Highly recommend it. The rental program he has set up makes it a lot more accessible to a lot of people. Yes, it does cost money. There is a sizable deposit. But you can at least try before you buy. And like I mentioned, if you do end up wanting to go with a shorter crank, you know, something like the Dixna cranks are actually a great affordable option. What's funny is, you know, having the YouTube channel, I've had the very fortunate opportunity to play with lots of interesting gear, but there's only a few things where you have a real aha moment that changes something significant with how you interface or ride with the bike. Using these fit cranks has been one of them. It's probably on par to me shifting from 700 to 650B tires. There are some downsides. You know, this whole process can be kind of expensive. You do at first initially kind of lose your lower gears. When you shift to a shorter crank, you end up raising your saddle, and that kind of changes the whole fit of the bike. If you've cut your steer tube, you know, to the hair's breadth of perfection, you're going to find it a little bit difficult to raise it up, potentially. That's why I always keep at least like a spacer or two's worth of steer tube, just so I can experiment, or maybe I have commitment phobia when it comes to, say, handlebar height, whatever. I had room to compensate, but that is something to keep in mind. What do you guys think of crank length? Have you guys experimented on your own? What have you found? How many of you are riding 155s or even 160s? Super curious. Do you guys think it's crazy that there's basically, you know, 170, 172.5, and 175 offered by the mainstream bike industry? If you guys like this video, appreciate the content. I always try to do something interesting and different. Consider supporting the channel by joining us on Patreon or buy some stickers. Pretty cheap and keeps this channel going. As always, keep the supple side down.